Alessia was 40 feet in the air when her whole life changed. She was standing on a narrow wooden plank bolted to scaffolding inside a Florentine basilica, her nose inches from a wall that was older than most countries. Her brush was no wider than a finger. The fresco she was working on showed the face of a woman mid-prayer, painted sometime in the early 1800s, and the paint along her jaw had been flacking for decades. Alessia had been working on that jaw for 3 days. She moved like someone diffusing something. Careful, patient. She breathed slow so her breath would not disturb the surface. Then her phone lit up. She almost ignored it. She always almost ignored it. But it was Beatrice, her younger sister, and Beatrice never called during working hours. The screen flickered with a bad connection. Alessia pressed the phone to her ear and held her breath for a different reason now. The first thing she heard was noise, voices, laughter, glass clinking. Then Beatrice's voice, tight and high and trying not to shake. "Alessia, I need you to see something." Camera swung, pixelated, blurry at first, then sharp enough to understand. It was her studio. The villa on the edge of the Tuscan hills that had belonged to her grandfather. The arched ceilings, the warm stone walls, the frescoes she had spent 11 years restoring and preserving and treating like the lungs of something still alive. And there, standing in the middle of it all, was her brother Matteo. He had a champagne flute in his hand. His jacket was off. He was laughing at something a man beside him had said, and the man was unfamiliar, dressed in the kind of casual that costs real money. They were clinking glasses like they were celebrating a birthday. In her studio, Beatrice whispered, "They put a sign in the garden this morning, Alessia. A sold sign." Alessia did not move for a full 3 seconds. The scaffolding groaned softly in the cold air above the basilica floor. 40 feet below her, tourists walked in and out of the light. "When?" she said. Her voice came out even. That surprised her. "Yesterday. They didn't tell you." She already knew the answer. She ended the call. She climbed down slowly, one rung at a time. She capped her brushes. She wrapped them in cloth the way her grandfather taught her. She did not rush. Rushing was for people who had not decided what they were going to do yet. Alessia had already decided. She booked the first flight she could find and sat in the airport for 6 hours with a folder in her lap. That folder had been sitting in a drawer for 2 years. Her grandfather, Enzo, had pressed it into her hands the winter before he died. He was a master mason. He had built and restored walls his whole life, and he understood them the way other people understood faces, as things that held history, that kept secrets, that could not simply be erased. He told her the folder mattered. He told her to keep it somewhere only she knew. She had read it once, understood enough to know it was important, and filed it away in the kind of quiet, careful way she filed most things. She read it again on the plane. By the time the wheels touched down, she understood exactly what her parents had done, and exactly what they had missed. She had grown up being the steady one. Lorenzo and Sofia, her parents, were not cruel people. They were the kind of people who meant well in ways that cost other people everything. They loved Matteo loudly, the way people love a dream they are still waiting to come true. He was the future, they always said. The startup, the pitch, the investors, the breakthrough that was always one more round away. They talked about him at dinner like he was something they had invented. They loved Alessia quietly, which mostly meant they forgot about her when she was not in the room. She was the responsible one. The one who sorted out her own problems, who never asked for too much, who had turned her grandfather's old villa into something serious, something recognized by the Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage itself. She did not need applause. She needed space to work. Her grandfather had given her that. When he died, he did not leave her money. He left her the villa and everything in it, including the walls, including the frescoes, including a registered legal status. She had renewed faithfully every 2 years without ever expecting anyone to try to take it from her. She had not expected it because it had not occurred to her that her own family would look at her life's work and see a number. The taxi turned onto the gravel road that curved up toward the villa, and she saw the sign before the car stopped. White background, black letters. The kind of sign that meant something was already over. She paid the driver and stood at the gate. Workers moved along the side of the building. A man with a clipboard stood near the front door writing something down. 2 others carried equipment through the garden, past the old lemon trees, past the low stone bench where her grandfather used to sit in the afternoon and tell her that a wall could remember everything that had ever touched it. Lorenzo and Sofia were standing just inside the open front door. They saw her at the same time. Her mother smiled. Her father looked like a man who had prepared his defense the night before. Back early, her mother said. Alesha walked past them into the studio. She stood in the room. The light was the same. The walls were the same. The frescoes were the same, at least for now. She turned around slowly and looked at her parents standing in the doorway of a place they had just given away. Sophia spread her hands wide, gentle, certain. You can restore art anywhere, Alesha. Alesha looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes, not anger exactly. Something quieter and more dangerous than anger. She almost smiled. What is funny? Her father asked, his voice edging toward impatience. She looked back at the wall, her grandfather's wall. The wall the buyer thought he had purchased, the wall her parents thought they had sold. She said quietly, the studio you sold was actually, and then she stopped. She let the silence sit there, heavy and still, the way a fresco sits in stone, patient, unmovable, waiting for whoever was looking to finally understand what they were seeing. Marco's office smelled like old paper and coffee that had been sitting too long. It was a small office, tucked above a dry-cleaning shop on a side street in Florence, the kind of place that looked unimportant on purpose. Marco Ferretti was not the kind of lawyer who needed a fancy address. He was the kind of lawyer who needed to be right, and in 20 years of practice, he rarely was not. Alesha sat across from him and placed the folder on the desk between them. He opened it without speaking. He read the way she restored slowly, without rushing, giving every line the attention it deserved. She watched his face while he read. His expression did not change much. But his eyebrows lifted once, just slightly, about halfway through the second page. That was enough. He set the folder down and looked at her. Your grandfather was a careful man, he said. He was, she said. Marco laced his fingers together. The frescoes inside the villa are registered as National Heritage Artifacts under Italian cultural preservation law. The registration is in your name, not the estate's, not your parents' names. Yours. He tapped the page. That registration covers not just the painted surface, but the structural layer beneath it, the plaster, the base coat, the section of wall the art is physically bonded to. Under heritage law, you cannot separate the painting from the wall it lives in. They are legally the same object. Alesha had understood this when she read it on the plane. Hearing it out loud from someone else made it land differently. Heavier, more real. So when my parents sold the villa, she said. They sold the building, Marco said. The shell, the roof, the floors, the exterior, the garden. But the walls inside the studio, the ones bearing registered heritage artwork, those were never theirs to sell. Not without your written consent and a formal heritage transfer application, which takes months and requires ministry approval. He paused. There was none of that. She already knew. She needed to hear it said plainly. Marco pulled the sale documents she had emailed him the night before and laid them out side by side. He pointed to a name she had not recognized when she first saw it. The buyer was not a developer. The buyer was a man named Ricardo Kant, and when Marco turned his laptop around to show her, she understood immediately. Ricardo Kant was listed on Matteo's startup website as the company's lead investor. The sale had not been a real sale to a real buyer. It had been a transaction between her brother and the man funding him, a way to transfer property value onto paper so Matteo could use the villa as collateral for a loan. A loan, Marco confirmed, that had already been drawn down. The money was already spent. Her parents had handed her grandfather's home to her brother's financial maneuver, and they had not even gotten cash for it. They had gotten a signature on a document that made Matteo look solvent on paper. Alesha sat with that for a moment. The room was quiet except for the sound of traffic 2 floors below. Her phone buzzed. Beatrice. She answered on the second ring. Beatrice did not say hello. She said, I need you to listen to something. A recording started playing through the phone. It was her parents' voices, low and familiar, captured in what sounded like the kitchen at the villa. The clink of cups. The sound of a chair scraping tile. Her mother's voice, smooth and certain, saying that Alesha would make noise at first but would fall in line once she realized fighting it would only embarrass the family. Her father's voice, quieter but not disagreeing, saying that the heritage registration was a technicality and that no one would pursue it if Alesha chose to be reasonable. They had known. They had known about the heritage status and planned to talk her out of using it. Beatrice's voice came back on, barely above a whisper. I recorded it 2 days ago. I didn't know what to do with it. I'm sorry it took me this long. Alesha closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She thought about her grandfather sitting on the stone bench in the garden. She thought about his hands, rough and paint-stained, pressing that folder into hers. She thought about how he had looked at her that day, steady and serious, like he was handing her something she would not understand until she needed it. "Send it to Marco," she said. "Send him everything." That evening, Matteo came to the small rental apartment where Alessia was staying. She heard him on the stairs before he knocked. He had always been loud without meaning to be. He knocked 3 times and waited, which was new. Usually he just walked in. She opened the door and he stood there in the hallway looking like a man who had rehearsed something and already forgotten half of it. He was thinner than she remembered. There were shadows under his eyes. "I just want to talk," he said. She let him in because she wanted to hear him say it himself. He sat at the small kitchen table and talked about the investor and the round closing and the runway and the timing, and all of it sounded like a language designed to make the actual thing he was describing harder to see clearly. She listened without interrupting. When he ran out of prepared words, he looked at her and said, "You always helped me, Alessia. Every time. I just needed you to help me one more time." Her mother was standing behind him in the doorway. Alessia had not heard her come up. Sophia looked at her daughter with eyes that were not asking for forgiveness. They were asking for compliance. There was a difference. "Being sentimental," her mother said. Her voice was calm and final, the way it always was when she had already decided what was true. "That has always been your weakness." Alessia looked at her mother for a long moment. She thought of her grandfather again. She thought of what he used to say, that a wall remembers everything that has ever touched it. She said nothing. She walked to the door and held it open. After they left, she called Marco. He had already drafted the injunction. He filed it before midnight. By morning, the demolition was legally frozen. Then a message came through from one of the workers at the villa, a photograph taken inside the studio. In it, a man in a hard hat was standing in front of the oldest wall in the room, the one that held the fresco her grandfather had spent 3 years painting and she had spent 11 years protecting. His arm was raised. In his hand was a mallet. The photograph was time-stamped 40 minutes before Marco's filing went through. Alessia stared at the image for a long time. Her hands were still. Her face was still. But something inside her had gone very quiet in the way that things go quiet just before they become impossible to ignore. The morning was cold and gray when Alessia drove back to the villa. She did not call ahead. She did not warn anyone. She simply got in the car Marco had arranged, with Marco sitting beside her and a folder on her lap, and she watched the Tuscan hills roll past the window in silence. The lemon trees along the roadside were bare. The sky sat low and flat above them like a ceiling that had come down too far. She had looked at that photograph all night. The mallet, the raised arm, the wall behind it holding a face her grandfather had painted with his own hands decades ago. A woman in pale blue robes looking upward with an expression that had always reminded Alessia of someone listening for something most people could not hear. She had spent 2 years on that fresco alone. 2 years of her life, pressed into the plaster one brushstroke at a time. She was not going to let it end with a mallet. The gravel crunched under the tires as the car turned through the gate. She saw them before they saw her. Ricardo Kant stood near the front of the villa with his phone pressed to his ear, dressed in an expensive coat, looking at the building the way men look at things they believe they own. Lorenzo and Sophia stood a few feet apart from each other near the garden wall, her father with his arms crossed, her mother with her chin lifted. Matteo paced the gravel path in short, tight circles, his hands in his hair. And inside the open front door, visible through the arch, a worker in a hard hat stood in front of the oldest wall in the studio with a mallet hanging from his right hand. Alessia was out of the car before it fully stopped. She walked through the front door and across the stone floor and placed herself between the worker and the wall. She did not run. She did not shout. She simply stood there, her back to the fresco, her face toward the room, calm in the way that a wall is calm, solid, immovable, built for exactly this. The worker lowered the mallet and stepped back. He looked confused. He looked at the door. Lorenzo came in behind her. His footsteps were fast and hard on the stone floor, and his voice was already raised before he reached her. "Alessia, move away from there. This is done. The decision is made." She did not move. Sophia appeared at his shoulder, her voice dropping into that smooth, controlled register she used when she wanted to sound like the reasonable one. "You are making a scene in front of people. This is embarrassing." Ricardo Kant stepped inside. He looked at Marco. His expression shifted from confident to careful. Matteo came in last. He stopped in the doorway and looked at his sister standing in front of their grandfather's fresco, and for one brief second something crossed his face that might have been shame. It did not stay long. Lorenzo stepped closer. His voice was the voice of a man who had decided how this moment would go. It is just paint, Alesha, do you understand that? It is pigment on plaster. Your brother needs a future. A real future, not a hobby, not a room full of old walls, a future. His voice cracked slightly at the end, not from emotion, from effort. Move away from there. Alesha looked at her father. She looked at him the way she looked at damaged frescoes, carefully, trying to find what was underneath, trying to understand what had happened to make something that was once whole come apart like this. She saw a man who loved his son so much he had stopped being able to see his daughter at all. She did not hate him for it. That was the saddest part. She had stopped expecting more from him a long time ago, and she had not even realized it until right now. She stepped aside, not away from the wall. She simply shifted her angle so Marco could move forward. Marco opened the folder and placed one document on the stone ledge near the door where everyone in the room could see it. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Frescoes in this studio are registered National Heritage Artifacts under Italian cultural preservation law, he said. The registration is held in Alesha Conti's name. Under that registration, the physical surface of these walls, the plaster, the base layer, and the painted surface, cannot be altered, removed, or damaged without ministry authorization. He paused. There was no authorization. There was no disclosure of heritage status in the sale agreement. That omission constitutes aggravated fraud against the buyer. He looked at Ricardo Kant directly. Against you. Room went very quiet. Ricardo Kant's face did something complicated. He looked at the document. He looked at Lorenzo. Lorenzo's arms had dropped to his sides. Sophia had stopped moving entirely. Marco continued. Damaging or destroying a fixed heritage artifact carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years under Italian law. Any person in this room who continues demolition after being informed of this status assumes full criminal liability. He closed the folder. Work on this interior is frozen. The sale is legally defective. It will be unwound. Ricardo Kant walked out without a word. He was already on his phone before he cleared the door. Whatever he was saying, his voice was low and fast and did not sound like someone who planned to stay involved. Matteo's face had gone the color of old plaster. He crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed Alesha's arm. His grip was not rough. It was desperate, which was worse. Sign a waiver, he said. His voice had collapsed into something she had not heard from him since they were children. Raw and small and frightened. Just tell them you approve. Tell them it's fine. Alesha, please, the startup is finished if this falls apart. I have nothing. I will have nothing. His eyes were wet. You always protected me, every time. Please. She looked at him. She looked at the brother she had covered for and cleaned up after and quietly carried for most of her adult life. She thought about all the times she had answered when she should have let it ring. All the times she had handed him something of hers because it was easier than watching him struggle. All the times she told herself it was love when it was actually just a habit she had never examined. She gently removed his hand from her arm. I spent years restoring the past, she said. I am not going to let you ruin my future. His face broke. He turned away. Her mother's voice came from across the room, sharp and high and stripped of its usual smoothness. You are doing this to punish us. You have always wanted to punish us. You are jealous of your brother and you have been your entire life. Alesha turned to face her. Sophia's chin was still lifted, but her eyes had gone glassy and uncertain, the eyes of a woman whose script had just stopped working. No, Alesha said, simply, evenly. I am doing this because I finally love myself more than I need your approval. Her mother flinched. The room flinched with her. Then Sophia's expression hardened back into something familiar and ugly. You have always been dramatic, she said, turning away. Always. Alesha watched her go. She felt the words land. She felt them sting. And then she felt them lose their power, not all at once, but enough. Enough to breathe around. Marco's hand on her shoulder was brief and steady. He stepped outside to make calls. Lorenzo followed without speaking, without looking at her, and that silence was its own kind of answer. Weeks passed. The sale was formally unwound. Ricardo Kant withdrew from Matteo's company, and the startup collapsed under its own weight within a month. The fraud investigation opened against Lorenzo and Sophia, quiet and procedural and impossible to charm away. Matteo stopped calling. The Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage approved Alesha's application to designate the studio as a protected cultural site. Open to scholars and restoration students, maintained under her official stewardship. It was not ownership the way her parents understood ownership. It was something deeper than that. It was responsibility, authority, a key that belonged to her and no one else. She asked Beatrice to manage it, the sister who had stood at a window with a shaking phone and chosen truth over peace. Beatrice said yes before Alessia finished the sentence. On the first morning Alessia walked back into the studio alone, she stood in the middle of the room and let herself feel it. The cold stone floor under her feet, the thin winter light falling through the high windows and landing exactly where it always had, on the far wall, on her grandfather's fresco, on the face of the woman in pale blue robes looking upward with that expression of quiet, patient listening. The room was intact. The walls remembered everything. She took a brush from her bag and walked to a section of plaster near the window that had been slowly losing its surface for years, a small patch she had been meaning to address since before she left for Florence. She mixed a color on her palm, the particular warm ivory of old Italian stone, and touched the bristles to the wall. Her hand did not shake. Her family had looked at this room and seen something to spend. She looked at it and saw something worth keeping. That was the distance between them, and she understood now that no amount of being useful or quiet or forgiving was ever going to close it. She worked until the light changed. She worked until the fresco was whole again. Outside, the lemon trees in the garden were beginning to bud. Small and pale and certain, pushing through the cold because that is what living things do when no one is trying to stop them anymore.